Hi everyone, once again, here's Joshua Meier, the cancer philosopher, and today we'll be talking about how we can fix cancer from the inside. Both approaches for actually targeting the cancer itself from the inside, but also how the whole theory of cancer, cancer treatment, and fighting the war from cancer had to change from fighting it from the outside, and we had to change it to an inner battle. So now the first thing to consider is in order to assess problems with cancer, we need a method in order to determine whether our progress is working. So that leads to the whole field of statistical measures. Now at this point in history, one of the really important things that was being considered was negative results versus positive results. With positive results, which was done in the past, usually scientists or doctors were trying to show that their method, their chemotherapy, or their approach was stronger than another method. The way they did this was with a positive method, as it's called. They would show results from the control, what's standardly done, and then they would show what they were doing, and they would show that there's a positive change. But negative results was different. How do you show that something is inherently bad? How do you show that something inherently does not work? The problem with that is if you had your control, well, then what are you going to show with your negatives? The patient died? Like that might not necessarily be enough. You might show that the control worked better, but it led into a whole problem with doctors, that doctors would, of course, they can sort of introduce bias this way. They would treat the patients who they thought would fail. They would only take patients into their studies that were probably going to die anyways, and then they would easily show negative results. So therefore, scientists and mathematicians came up with a new method, a new statistical method called power. And essentially what power is a test of how many trials have been done. Once again, though, there's another problem that comes up, because in order to have a lot of power, you need to recruit an adequate number of patients. In order to recruit an adequate number of patients, you need to have doctors who agree. In order to have doctors agree, they have to like what you're doing. And the problem is doctors never like what researchers are doing, because doctors are the ones who don't want something proved or disproved, because obviously then they would lose their power. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but there was a drift that started to occur between doctors and physicians and between researchers. And the reason for this is that when researchers would show something, let's say they show a new chemotherapy, the doctor or surgeon wouldn't be able to do as much of their work anymore. And obviously they lose their prestige, so they weren't happy about that. But in order to counter that, the National Surgical Adjuvant Breast and Bowel Project ran a large randomized trial to test radical mastectomies. And essentially, the way that they got over this problem is through randomization. They came up with randomized trials, and by doing everything randomly, you get rid of all these problems. So the way that we could use power is through randomization. But now the next question, after we figured out how exactly to test cancer, is what should we do? So I really like this quote that was brought up in the book from a journalist talking with the NIH, and what he says here is that saving the individual patient is not the essential mission. Enormous efforts are made to do so, or at least to prolong the patient's life to the last possible moment. But the basic purpose is not to save the patient's particular life, but to find the means of saving the lives of others. And what Alsop is saying here is that cancer, the fight about cancer, was not to save an individual patient, but rather to progress the field at large. And that brings up the whole concept of power once again, because power was not confined to individuals, but was rather talking about large studies. How much power does your study have? And Alsop was saying that when you started to have this focus on power, then you started to get a little bit more heartless detachment. And physicians didn't care as much about the patients as it did about the field as a whole. But now, this led to a lot of dissidence within the field. Specifically, I want to talk about dissidence against chemotherapy. So the first one is indiscriminate. There are basically two main problems that people brought up with chemotherapy. The first was targeting indiscriminate chemotherapy. So what a lot of physicians were doing was they were taking chemotherapy, putting more and more and more and more, and essentially they thought that more was better. And that just pulling out loads of drugs just from the truck could be the only way to attack cancer. What these dissidents thought is that, contrary to the prevailing dogma, cancer cells needed to possess unique and specific vulnerabilities that render them particularly sensitive to certain chemicals that have little impact on normal cells. So that might sound, when I read that at first, I was a bit confused when I read that in the book. But what I think is what they were trying to say is that cancer is different than normal cells. And because it's different, there must be some way to target it differently than normal cells. And if we can target cancer specifically and not target the rest of the cells, we don't need a strong chemotherapy. We don't have to wipe out the whole body. And that led to basically their second concern, which was that we shouldn't just be trying random chemotherapies all the time and trying to see what works, but rather we have to uncover the deep biology of cancer. Now, cancer-specific therapies existed at the time, but what these people argued is that they had to be tested from the bottom up and not the top down. What that means is that the bottom up would be solving basic biological riddles of each type of cancer. And what they were saying is that we have to try each cancer, figure out what works for that cancer, what targets that cancer, and then use it. However, during the time, a top-down approach was favored, and that meant maximizing cytotoxic chemotherapy or discovering cellular poisons empirically. And what these dissidents were saying is that's sort of a waste of time, and if we just keep trying everything, we're not going to have success. So that's where I have this picture of a bullet here. What these people are saying is that we need to search for a magic bullet in order to attack cancer and not just try everything. If we just start shooting with a rifle, if we just start shooting with a machine gun, we're not going to find anything. But rather, we need to just take a rifle and shoot each cancer by itself. So now how exactly do we do that? We're looking everywhere. So with this bottom-up approach, one of the first things that was looked at was prostate cancer. And scientists found that prostate cancer could be starved to near death by choking off testosterone. So normally prostate cells need that testosterone in order to grow, and the scientists found that prostate cancer needed it as well. So now they asked, this is a bottom-up approach, we have it for prostate cancer, let's move up a level. Can we take this and apply it to another cancer? Can we starve off other hormone-dependent cancers? So we start on the prostate cancer level, can we move up to hormone-dependent cancers? The answer is kind of. Why? Well, first, let's discuss another similar approach. So now ICI 4674 was a non-effective contraceptive that was developed. But what it was found is that it could be used against cancer. And why? Because essentially, by thinking back, this relates back to Meier tamoxifen trial. And what happened is estrogen receptors. That's where this all falls into. Estrogen receptors, as you can see over here, an estrogen molecule would try and get into the cell, and it would depend whether or not there was an estrogen receptor there. Estrogen receptor positive cells would be able to utilize this. And essentially what happens is that ICI 4674 would act as a decoy molecule. It would fill up that receptor, and therefore other things would not be able to get in there. So even though it was not an effective contraceptive, it was still able to be used against the fight of cancer. So now coming back to what we're talking about here, Meier tamoxifen trial. Meier was initially interested in treating women with advanced cancer, but she thought, well, if this is working with advanced cancers, then what about treating lower grade cases? Perhaps this is a bit too intense, but intensity is always good, people thought. So she was inspired by Halstead's radical mastectomies, and what he did is he was just cutting out everything. Meier thought that maybe it's not about cutting out everything, but maybe we just need a different tool. Let's just put in all the chemotherapy, and maybe if we have a lot of it, then we can completely get rid of the cancer. So now Halstead's fantasy of attacking early-stage cancers was therefore reborn at adjuvant therapy. So what you would do is first you would do a little surgery, and then you would pour in the chemotherapy. And that was indeed this magic bullet that was coming up here with anti-hormone therapy for breast and prostate cancer. What you do is, like we said before, you put in a decoy for your estrogen receptors. That's why tamoxifen, there's a lot of research being done with estrogen receptor positive and estrogen receptor negative cancers with tamoxifen, because tamoxifen is sort of just you're sort of clogging up your estrogen receptor, and then you can it's therefore a way of dealing with cancer. So now this leads to new thoughts on cancer. Cancer is clearly enormously heterogeneous. So at first, scientists were a bit confused. Why was this working in estrogen receptor positive, but not working in estrogen receptor negative? Why was there a difference there? They didn't classify the two cancers at first, and it just seemed like it was happening in half the cases. But what they found is that cancer is enormously heterogeneous. And this leads to something that's really reverberating throughout cancer research. What you see in the book is that there's really two main things that scientists are shifting between. Know thine enemy, and one cause, one cure. So people are naturally self-confident and arrogant, and they were favoring the more one cause, one cure dogma. And they said, we need one cause, one cure, let's find it. And that was what they used for their motivation. But really, what the real words of wisdom are know thy enemy. That you have to know every single enemy differently, every single cancer. We have to target that cancer. Cancer is heterogeneous. We can't just get one cause. We have to focus all over the place, and that's the way that we'll succeed. And that leads to our next thing, which is if we're focused on every single thing, not only do we have to focus on the cure, but we have to focus on prevention. We'll talk about this later in a different video, but essentially prevention the prevalence of other diseases had swindled because humankind had learned how to prevent diseases. And that's what had to happen with cancer. We have to understand cancer. That leads back to our thing with dissonance before. We have to understand cancer in order to prevent it. And that's the true way